When mechanics became heroes, the workshop that won the war, the cathedral bells of Saint-Étienne rang out across the newly liberated French town, not in celebration, but in a solemn toll that marked the hour for the sound that had been absent during the long years of occupation. The sound traveled through streets still littered with the debris of hasty German retreat, past buildings whose facades bore the scars of conflict, and into the cavernous interior of what had once been a bicycle factory on the town's eastern edge. Inside, amid the smell of motor oil, scorched metal, and the lingering acrid scent of war that seemed embedded in everything, Antoine Marchand wiped grease-stained hands on a rag that had once been white but now bore the layered history of countless repairs. He paused as the last bell faded, allowing himself a moment of stillness in what had been years of frantic motion. The war was over, had been over for 3 months now, but the habits of survival were not so easily shed. The need to keep moving, to fix, to improvise, to make functional what others declared irreparable, these impulses remained even as the immediacy of their purpose faded. The workshop around him bore witness to this compulsion. Where once the space had housed the secret maintenance of resistance vehicles, trucks disguised as farm equipment, motorcycles with engines modified for silent running, ancient cars kept operational through engineering miracles that bordered on alchemy, now it contained the broken machinery of a nation struggling to rebuild, tractors with parts cannibalized from abandoned German tanks, delivery vans assembled from the components of 3 or 4 damaged vehicles, construction equipment modified from military surplus. The skills that had kept the resistance mobile, that had maintained the clandestine infrastructure of rebellion, were now turned toward reconstruction. The mechanics who had once been heroes of the Shadow War, keeping the lifeblood of resistance flowing through occupied France, now found themselves heroes of a different kind. The ones who could make something, anything, work in a country where manufacturing had been redirected toward German war aims for years, where supply chains had collapsed, where the machinery of ordinary life had deteriorated or been destroyed. Antoine moved toward the large central workbench, where a tractor engine lay partially disassembled, its components arranged with the meticulous precision that had become his trademark during the war years. The owner, a farmer from the outskirts of Saint-Étienne, had explained that without it, the harvest would rot in the fields. No new parts were available, no replacements to be found in a nation still reeling from occupation. But Antoine had learned during the darkest days of war that impossible was merely a challenge rather than a conclusion. His fingers, calloused and scarred but possessing an almost supernatural sensitivity, moved over the damaged components, his mind already calculating adaptations, substitutions, the alchemy of making something from nothing. This was the legacy of the workshop that had become legendary among resistance circles, the place where miracles of mechanical ingenuity had been performed, where the impossible had been routine, where the mechanics had become heroes by keeping wheels turning when all should have stopped. The sound of footsteps on the concrete floor drew Antoine's attention from the engine. Michel Dubois, his oldest friend and the workshop's electrical specialist, approached with a telegram in hand. Michel's face, which had maintained its capacity for boyish enthusiasm, despite everything he had witnessed during the occupation, now bore an unusual solemnity. "It's from Paris," he said simply, extending the paper toward Antoine. "Department of Reconstruction." Antoine wiped his hands again before accepting the telegram, leaving faint smudges along its edge nonetheless. His eyes moved over the official language, the formal request, the implications expanding in his mind with each word. The newly formed government ministry was requesting, though the language made clear it was more directive than request, that Antoine and his team of mechanics travel to Paris to establish a central workshop for the adaptation of military surplus equipment for civilian reconstruction use. The skills developed in their clandestine operation during the war were now deemed essential to national recovery. Antoine handed the telegram back to Michel, turning to look out over the workshop, where 5 other men worked with the focused intensity that had defined their operations during the occupation. These men had been his family, his brothers in the shadow war against impossibility. They had worked without recognition, without acknowledgement, their victories celebrated only in the continued movement of resistance networks, in supplies that reached their destinations, in operations that succeeded because vehicles functioned when they should have failed. Now the government was asking them to step from the shadows, to apply their hard-won knowledge to the monumental task of rebuilding a broken nation. The irony was not lost on Antoine. During the occupation, discovery would have meant torture and execution. Now recognition meant being called to service of a different kind. "What will you tell them?" Michel asked, folding the telegram with mechanical precision, a habit from days when every piece of paper could be incriminating evidence. Antoine didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved from face to face in the workshop. Jean-Pierre, who could fabricate components from scrap metal with artisanal precision. Claude, whose understanding of hydraulic systems bordered on the mystical. Victor, who had been a mathematics professor before the war and brought theoretical precision to practical problems. René, the youngest, who had an almost supernatural ability to diagnose engine problems by sound alone. And Louis, the oldest among them, a veteran of the Great War whose decades of experience had proven invaluable when adapting unfamiliar German equipment. These men had risked everything, not for glory or recognition, but because their skills were needed. Would they leave Saint-Étienne, where each had begun to rebuild personal lives fractured by war? Would they exchange their hard-won return to normalcy for the chaos of Paris and the pressure of national expectations? The decision was not Antoine's alone to make. "I'll tell them what we decide together," Antoine replied finally. "Tonight, after we finish the day's work, we'll talk then." Michel nodded, understanding the implications. During the occupation, their decisions had often meant the difference between life and death, success or capture. Now the stakes were different, but no less significant. They were being asked to help determine how France would physically rebuild itself from the ruins of occupation and conflict. Whatever they decided would shape not just their own futures, but contribute to the reimagining of a nation struggling to find its post-war identity. Antoine returned to the tractor engine, his hands resuming their exploration of metal and possibility, but his mind now working on a different problem: how to present this unexpected opportunity to men who had sacrificed years of their lives to a cause and might reasonably expect peace to mean a return to private ambitions rather than new public obligations. The day passed in the rhythm of work that had become second nature, a symphony of tools against metal, the murmured consultations over particularly challenging problems, the satisfaction of making function what had seemed beyond repair. Antoine didn't mention the telegram, allowing each man to focus on the immediate tasks rather than future uncertainties. As dusk approached, transforming the workshop's windows into rectangles of deepening blue, he finally called them together. The men gathered around the central workbench, wiping hands, setting aside tools, shifting from the isolated focus of individual tasks to the collective awareness that had characterized their most difficult operations during the war. Antoine placed the telegram on the bench where all could see it, explaining its contents in the direct manner they had come to expect from him. Then he fell silent, waiting for their responses, refusing to influence their thoughts with his own inclinations. The reactions varied, reflecting the different ways each man had experienced the transition from occupation to liberation. Jean-Pierre, who had lost his wife during an Allied bombing raid, was immediately opposed. "I stayed for the war," he said, his voice carrying the roughness acquired from years of shouting over engine noise. "I gave those years because I had no choice. Now I have choices again. My daughter needs stability, not another upheaval." Claude, by contrast, leaned forward with interest, his perpetually oil-stained fingers tapping a thoughtful rhythm on the workbench. "Paris is where the decisions are being made," he observed. "If we want to have any say in how reconstruction happens, that's where we need to be." Victor removed his wire-rimmed glasses, polishing them methodically with a clean section of his handkerchief, a gesture Antoine recognized as his way of buying time to process complicated variables. "The technical challenges would be significant," he said finally. "Scaling what we've done here to a national level, it's not simply a matter of doing more of the same." René, who at 26 had spent his entire adult life in the shadow of war, looked torn between excitement at the new opportunity and loyalty to the community they had formed. "What exactly would they expect from us?" he asked, directing the question to Antoine as if he might have information beyond what the telegram contained. Louis, who had been leaning against a support column, his arthritic hands resting on the walking stick he'd increasingly relied upon, spoke with the measured certainty of his 62 years. "They expect miracles," he said simply. "The same miracles we performed here, but on a scale that might actually allow this country to function again." He pushed himself away from the column, moving slowly to stand directly across from Antoine. "The question isn't what they want from us, but what we are willing to give now that giving is a choice rather than a necessity." The workshop fell silent as the weight of his words settled over them. During the occupation, their skills had been dedicated to resistance by moral imperative. To refuse would have been to accept defeat. Now, with liberation achieved, the moral calculation was more complex, the lines between obligation and choice less clearly defined. Michel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Perhaps we should consider what happens if we refuse," he suggested. "Someone will attempt this work regardless. The need won't disappear because we choose to return to private life. The question is whether that someone will have our experience, our understanding of how to adapt military equipment effectively, our knowledge of what works and what only appears to work until catastrophe occurs." He looked around at each face, his expression serious. How many lives might depend on this work being done properly? How many reconstruction projects might fail because the equipment wasn't properly modified? These aren't abstract considerations. We've seen what happens when machinery fails at critical moments. The reference to darker days hung unspoken between them, memories they all carried of operations compromised, of lives lost when equipment faltered. Antoine watched their faces as Michel's words registered, saw the subtle shifts in expression that suggested internal recalculations, the weighing of personal desires against broader obligations. Whatever they had been before the war, bicycle mechanics, factory workers, university academics, the years of resistance had transformed them into something else, something for which the French language had no precise term. They had become the invisible infrastructure of rebellion, the men who kept possibility alive through the mechanical alchemy of their workshop. Could they now simply set aside those hard-won skills and return to ordinary life? Antoine allowed the silence to extend, knowing from experience that each man needed to reach his own conclusion without pressure. Outside, darkness had fully settled over Saint-Étienne, the limited street lighting of post-war austerity, creating pools of illumination separated by stretches of shadow, not unlike the fragmentary nature of their current existence, caught between the all-consuming purpose of resistance and the uncertain future of reconstruction. Finally, Antoine spoke again. "We don't need to decide tonight," he said. "Each of you should consider what this means for your own life, your own plans. We'll meet again tomorrow evening." He looked around at the circle of faces, men bonded by years of shared danger and common purpose. "Whatever we decide together, as we always have." With nods of acknowledgement, the group dispersed, each man returning to the final tasks of their workday, but Antoine could see their movements had changed, becoming more deliberate as minds processed this unexpected turn in their post-war journey. Antoine was the last to leave the workshop that night, securing it with the multiple locks that had been essential during occupation and were now habitual rather than necessary. The streets of Saint-Étienne were largely empty as he made his way to the small apartment he'd reclaimed after liberation. Like most of the town, it showed the signs of neglect enforced by years of material shortages: peeling paint, missing roof tiles patched with whatever had been available, windows repaired with uneven glass. The entire nation existed in this state of improvisational maintenance, holding together through adaptations and compromises. As he climbed the narrow stairs to his third-floor rooms, Antoine found himself mentally cataloguing the building's needed repairs, the professional habit of identifying mechanical problems extending to his surroundings without conscious effort. This was the lens through which he now viewed the world, not as it was intended to be, but as a series of systems requiring intervention to function. Inside his apartment, sparse but meticulously organized, Antoine removed his work clothes and washed away the day's accumulation of grease and metal dust in a basin of water he'd heated on his small stove. The routine was so familiar, it required no thought, leaving his mind free to consider the telegram and its implications. The truth was, he had felt increasingly restless in the months since liberation. The emergency repairs that had occupied the workshop in the immediate aftermath, fixing essential services, adapting military vehicles for civilian use, improvising solutions to critical infrastructure needs, had gradually given way to more ordinary work. Important, certainly, but lacking the intense sense of purpose that had defined their efforts during occupation. He had noticed similar restlessness in some of the others, particularly Claude and René, though they hadn't spoken of it directly. Perhaps the telegram offered not just obligation, but opportunity, a chance to apply their unique skills to problems worthy of their capabilities, to contribute to rebuilding in ways that might transcend the local impact of their current work. Sleep came fitfully that night, his dreams filled with mechanical problems of impossible complexity, with engines that transformed as he worked on them, with the sound of German patrols that morphed into the rumble of construction equipment. He woke before dawn, his mind still turning over possibilities like an engine cycling through ignition sequences. By the time he arrived at the workshop, the first light of morning filtering through windows in need of cleaning, Antoine had reached his own conclusion. He would go to Paris if the others agreed, would accept this new mission not from any sense of glory or recognition, but because the work needed doing, and he had the skills to do it. The same simple calculus that had guided his decision to join the resistance now directed his thoughts toward reconstruction. As the others arrived, he noticed in their faces the same signs of restless nights, of difficult deliberations. Whatever their individual decisions, none had taken the telegram's implications lightly. The day passed in focused work, each man attending to his tasks with the professional dedication that had become their shared characteristic during years when failure could mean death. They spoke little beyond the technical consultations necessary for their repairs, respecting the internal processes each was undergoing. By late afternoon, as they gathered again around the central workbench, Antoine could sense that decisions had been reached, though the tension in the air suggested those decisions might not align. He looked around at these men who had become more than colleagues, more than friends even. They had become a kind of mechanical family, forged in the pressure of resistance. "We need to send a response," he said simply. "What shall it be?" Jean-Pierre spoke first, his expression conflicted. "I meant what I said yesterday. My daughter needs stability, but—" He hesitated, struggling to articulate thoughts clearly painful to him. "She also needs a country that functions again. Her mother died because of this war. I don't want her growing up in ruins because I chose comfort over contribution." He looked directly at Antoine. "I'll go, but not permanently. 3 months. That's what I can give." Claude nodded vigorously. "Paris makes sense. That's where the decisions about equipment allocation are happening. We should be there, influencing how these adaptations are standardized." Victor removed his glasses again, but this time the gesture seemed less about buying time and more about allowing him to focus directly on his companions without the barrier of lenses. "The technical challenges are significant," he repeated his observation from the previous evening, "but that makes our expertise more essential, not less. If anyone can develop systems for scaled adaptation of military equipment, it's this workshop." René's youthful face showed excitement breaking through initial reservation. "If we're really going to help rebuild France, Paris is where it has to happen. I'm in." All eyes turned to Louis, the eldest among them, whose experience they had come to rely upon in the most difficult technical challenges. He remained silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "I'm too old to relocate again," he said finally. "My bones have had enough of adventure." A weight seemed to settle over the group at his words. The prospect of moving forward without his guidance felt like losing a critical component. But then he continued, his voice gathering strength. "However, I can document our methods, can create the manuals and training materials that would allow others to apply what we've learned. I'll stay in Saint-Étienne, maintain the workshop here, and support from distance." His gaze met Antoine's directly. "The work will need both centralization and distribution. What we develop in Paris must eventually spread throughout the provinces. This workshop can become a training center, a place where mechanics from across the region can learn the techniques you refine in the capital." The elegant practicality of Louis's proposal shifted the energy in the room. It wasn't a matter of going or staying, but of creating a network, much as they had done during the resistance, when their workshop had been only one node in a complex system of support. Michel, who had been quietly listening, now spoke with growing enthusiasm. "Louis is right, we're thinking too narrowly. The telegram asks us to establish a central workshop, but what France needs is a system of workshops, a method of training ordinary mechanics to perform the kinds of adaptations we've developed." He turned to Antoine. "We should propose a more comprehensive approach. Yes, a central facility in Paris, where we can work directly with the Ministry on standardization and major adaptations, but also a program to extend these methods nationally, with this workshop as the first satellite operation." Antoine felt the familiar sensation of disparate components aligning into a functioning whole. This was what had made their workshop exceptional during the darkest days, not just technical skill, but the ability to see beyond immediate problems to systemic solutions. They had never been merely mechanics. They had been systems thinkers who happened to work with engines and machinery. "Then we accept," he said, looking around the circle for confirmation, "but with our own conditions. We're not simply relocating to become government employees. We're establishing a program that can multiply our impact." The nods were unanimous now, even Jean-Pierre seeing how this approach might allow him to contribute without permanent relocation. "I'll draft the response tonight," Antoine continued. "We'll leave for Paris next week once we've arranged for the continuation of essential services here." As the meeting broke up, the men returning to their final tasks of the day with renewed energy, Antoine felt a familiar sense of purpose taking shape. Not the desperate urgency of resistance, but the steady commitment of reconstruction. The mechanics who had become heroes in secret during the war would now apply their skills to the visible challenges of rebuilding a broken nation. The journey to Paris a week later revealed the full extent of France's post-war condition. The roads, damaged by years of military traffic and neglected maintenance, were a patchwork of repairs. Some sections smooth and functional, others requiring careful navigation around craters or washouts. Bridges showed the hasty reconstructions of military necessity, temporary structures already showing signs of stress under civilian use. The countryside itself seemed exhausted, fields lying fallow not from seasonal rest, but from lack of equipment to work them, from shortage of able-bodied men to manage harvests, from the disruption of agricultural cycles by years of conflict. The cities and towns they passed through existed in states ranging from relatively untouched to severely damaged, depending on their strategic significance during the German retreat and Allied advance. But everywhere there was activity, people working with whatever tools and materials were available, beginning the long process of physical recovery. Antoine, driving the lead vehicle of their small convoy, found himself mentally cataloguing the mechanical needs visible in each area they passed, the types of equipment that would make the greatest difference, the adaptations that would be most essential. The team traveled in 3 vehicles that embodied their wartime ingenuity. Trucks that had begun as German military transport, been captured and modified for resistance use, and now served civilian purposes with further adaptations. Each carried tools and essential equipment, specialized instruments developed during occupation that existed nowhere else in France, the accumulated technical documentation of their improvisations and innovations. These were their credentials, more meaningful than any official papers, the physical embodiment of knowledge gained through years of mechanical necessity. As they approached Paris, the traffic increased, military vehicles still predominant, but now intermixed with civilian transport of every conceivable type. Bicycles modified to carry impossible loads, horse carts with automotive components grafted onto them, cars of pre-war vintage kept running through increasingly creative maintenance. The city itself came into view late in the afternoon, its familiar silhouette largely intact, but showing signs of damage more evident as they drew closer. Buildings with walls missing, exposing interior floors like dollhouses, opened for inspection. Temporary bridges spanning the Seine where permanent structures had been destroyed, the scars of street fighting still visible in bullet-pocked facades. Their destination was an industrial district in the eastern part of the city, where a former aircraft maintenance facility had been designated as their new workshop. As they navigated through streets crowded with the complexity of post-liberation Paris, Allied military personnel, returning French citizens, foreign aid workers, black market operators, Antoine felt a growing certainty that their decision had been correct. The need here was palpable, the gap between available equipment and reconstruction requirements even more severe than in the provinces. They found the facility without difficulty, its massive doors standing open to the late afternoon light, revealing an interior space far larger than their workshop in Saint-Étienne. A small group of officials waited to receive them, led by a middle-aged man whose clothing suggested civilian authority rather than military rank. Monsieur Marchand, he stepped forward as Antoine exited the lead truck, extending his hand. I am Henri Bergeron, Deputy Minister for Equipment Allocation. We are most grateful for your team's acceptance of our invitation. Antoine shook the offered hand, noting the softness that suggested administrative rather than manual work. We've come with conditions, he said directly, bypassing the diplomatic niceties that had never been part of his professional approach. We will establish the central workshop as requested, but as part of a larger program that includes provincial training and distributed adaptation facilities. If Bergeron was surprised by this immediate assertion of terms, he concealed it well. Of course, he replied smoothly. That's precisely why we sought your team specifically. Your reputation during the occupation, he paused, correcting himself, during the resistance, suggested you understand systemic approaches rather than merely mechanical solutions. The diplomatic phrasing did not disguise the implication. Their clandestine work had been more thoroughly documented than they might have realized. Their methods observed and evaluated, even as they believed themselves to be operating in necessary secrecy. Antoine exchanged glances with Michel, who had joined him while the others began unloading their vehicles. The same question passed between them silently. Just how much did the new government know about their resistance operations? Bergeron seemed to sense their unasked question. France is rebuilding not just its physical infrastructure, but its institutional knowledge, he said. gesturing for them to follow him into the facility. We are attempting to formalize and extend the innovations that emerged from necessity during occupation. Your workshop was not the only one providing mechanical support to resistance operations, but it was by all accounts the most effective, the most innovative in its approaches. Inside, the aircraft maintenance facility revealed its potential: high ceilings with overhead cranes, extensive work areas, storage sections for parts and equipment, even offices that had once housed Luftwaffe administrators and now stood empty, awaiting new purpose. "This will be the central facility," Bergeron explained as they walked through the cavernous space. "We've secured initial equipment allocations from American surplus, British contributions, and what we could salvage from abandoned German depots. First shipments arrive tomorrow." He turned to face Antoine and Michel directly. "What we lack is not materials but methodology, a systematic approach to adaptation that your team developed. That's what we're asking you to establish here, to document, to extend throughout the reconstruction effort." The frankness of Bergeron's assessment aligned with Antoine's own evaluation of their situation. France did not need heroes now. The immediate crisis of occupation had ended. What it needed was systems, methods, approaches that could be replicated and scaled to address the monumental task of physical rebuilding. The mechanics who had become heroes through necessity could now make their greatest contribution by transforming their hard-won knowledge into processes that others could implement. "We'll need full authority over technical decisions," Antoine said, the terms forming in his mind as he assessed the facility and its possibilities. "No bureaucratic interference in methodological development, and direct communication channels with the provincial workshops will establish, starting with Saint-Étienne." Bergeron nodded without hesitation. "Agreed. The Ministry understands that your expertise is irreplaceable. We provide resources and official sanction. You provide the technical direction that will make reconstruction possible on the scale required." He extended his hand again, this time with greater respect evident in his posture. "Do we have an understanding, Monsieur Marchand?" Antoine took the offered hand, sealing an agreement that would transform his team's role in France's recovery. "We begin tomorrow," he said simply. As Bergeron departed, leaving them to continue exploring their new workspace, the full team gathered in what would become their central planning area. "Well," Claude said, looking around at the facility that dwarfed their provincial workshop, "it seems we've been promoted from secret heroes to official saviors." The observation carried no bitterness, only a recognition of how dramatically their circumstances had changed in the short months since liberation. René moved from one workstation to another, evaluating the equipment that remained and the spaces where new tools would be installed. "We could process 20 vehicles simultaneously in here," he said, professional assessment overriding the initial overwhelm of the space. Victor was already making notes, calculating optimal workflows, sketching potential layouts for specialized adaptation sections. Jean-Pierre, who had been the most reluctant to relocate, stood quietly absorbing the scale of what they had committed to. 3 months may not be enough," he said finally, his tone suggesting both resignation and recognition of necessity. "My daughter will understand. She always has." Antoine watched his team begin to engage with their new environment, each man already processing the space through the lens of his particular expertise, already seeing the possibilities where others might see only an empty facility waiting to be filled. This had been their strength during the occupation, the ability to see potential where others saw only problems, to envision functioning systems where others saw only broken components. Now that vision would be applied not to sustaining resistance, but to enabling recovery. Not to sabotaging an occupier, but to rebuilding a nation. The workshop that had won the war through mechanical ingenuity would now help win the peace through systematic adaptation. As darkness fell over Paris, the team continued their assessment of the facility, their voices echoing in the cavernous space, their presence transforming it from abandoned war infrastructure to the beginnings of a new kind of operation, one that would ultimately influence how France physically rebuilt itself from the ruins of occupation and conflict. The next morning arrived with the promised deliveries, trucks bearing salvaged German equipment, American surplus, British contributions, and the miscellaneous accumulation of parts and materials gathered from across the newly liberated territories of France. Antoine and his team watched as crates were unloaded, as vehicles in various states of function or disrepair were brought into the facility, as mountains of components, both familiar and novel, accumulated in the sorting areas they had designated the previous evening. The scale was overwhelming, but also exhilarating. After years of working with severely limited resources, scavenging and improvising with whatever could be found or stolen or salvaged, the abundance of materials represented possibilities beyond what they had allowed themselves to imagine during occupation. "It's like all our Christmases arrived at once," Michelle observed as they surveyed the growing inventory. "Except the toys are broken, and we still have to fix them before we can play." The observation captured their collective sentiment, excitement at the resources now available, tempered by recognition of the immense work required to transform this mechanical bounty into useful equipment for reconstruction. Bergeron arrived mid-morning with what appeared to be administrative staff, people carrying clipboards and folders, their clothing and demeanor suggesting bureaucratic rather than technical orientation. Antoine intercepted them before they could begin what looked suspiciously like an inventory process. "No," he said simply, positioning himself between the administrators and the accumulating materials. "We will manage the inventory according to technical categorization, not administrative convenience. Your people can return when we've established the system." Bergeron seemed about to object, then reconsidered, perhaps remembering their agreement of the previous day. "The ministry requires documentation of all materials received," he said, his tone reasonable but firm, "for allocation tracking and future requisitioning." Antoine nodded, understanding the legitimate need while still rejecting the proposed method. "We'll provide daily reports categorized by technical application potential rather than original designation. Your forms and categories are designed for conventional equipment used conventionally. What we're doing here is unconventional by definition. Adapting military equipment for civilian applications requires different classification systems."